On the frozen steppes of Russia, German soldiers crouched in ruined buildings, listening. The sound wasn't artillery. It wasn't the crack of a rifle. It was something worse, an unmistakable roar like a ripping saw tearing the night apart. The Soviets were coming, and leading the charge was the weapon the Germans came to fear above all else, the PPSH-41, the dreaded Burp Gun. The PPSH-41 was born out of desperation, necessity, and brutal efficiency. In 1940, as Stalin prepared for the looming clash with Hitler's war machine, Soviet engineers knew they needed a weapon that could be produced in massive numbers, quickly and cheaply, without sacrificing power. Designer Georgy Shpagin answered the call. His submachine gun would be a masterpiece of simplicity. A stamped metal frame, a wooden stock, and a basic blowback action that anyone could assemble on a factory floor. Unlike Germany's meticulously crafted MP38 and MP40, which required precision machining, the PPSH could be churned out in days, not weeks. It was more than just a gun. It was an industrial miracle. Soviet workers, many of them women and teenagers, rolled them off assembly lines by the thousands. Each PPSH was proof of Stalin's doctrine of quantity over finesse. Drown the enemy in firepower and bury them under the sheer weight of production. By the time the German invasion, Operation Barbarossa, erupted in 1941, the Red Army was scrambling to rearm. Rifles alone couldn't hold back the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg. But with the PPSH-41, ordinary infantrymen were suddenly transformed into stormtroopers of their own, capable of unleashing blizzards of bullets in close combat. This weapon wasn't about elegance, it was about survival. The Germans would soon learn that the PPSH-41 wasn't just another submachine gun. It was a symbol of Soviet resilience, a weapon that promised to meet every attack with an answer of overwhelming fire. And once its distinct roar echoed across the front lines, the battlefield would never sound the same again. When the PPSH-41 first appeared in Soviet hands, German soldiers didn't quite know what they were facing. But the moment it opened fire, the battlefield told the story. At up to 900 rounds per minute, the PPSH didn't fire like a rifle. It erupted. The gun spat lead so quickly that its sound blurred into a buzzing roar, earning it nicknames like the Burp Gun or Ratch Bum. For Soviet soldiers in close combat, it was a game changer. Instead of carefully aiming a bolt-action rifle shot, they unleashed floods of bullets. Clearing trenches, storming buildings, or ambushing patrols, the PPSH didn't just kill, it overwhelmed. German infantry, armed mostly with the 5-shot Kar 98K, found themselves hopelessly outpaced in short-range fights. They could squeeze off one shot, maybe two, while a Soviet gunner could unload an entire magazine. Psychologically, it was devastating. Veterans recalled the sheer shock of a PPSH attack, the deafening chatter, the spray of bullets, the impossibility of keeping one's head up under such fire. Even seasoned Wehrmacht troops admitted that once the distinctive sound echoed through ruins or forests, their nerves tightened because they knew what was coming: speed, aggression, and a hailstorm of bullets. The PPSH was not perfect. Its rapid fire made accuracy harder, and inexperienced soldiers could waste ammo quickly. But in the chaos of close-quarter battle, volume mattered more than precision. Against charging Soviet troops, German soldiers learned to fear not just the men themselves, but the sound of their guns, which seemed to promise only one thing: overwhelming destruction. If the PPSH's rate of fire terrified its enemies, its magazine made it even worse. Unlike most submachine guns of the era, which carried 20 to 30 rounds, the PPSH carried a staggering 71 rounds in its drum magazine. To German troops, it seemed endless. Bursts that should have stopped after a few seconds just kept going, hammering without pause. This firepower shifted the balance of entire skirmishes. Imagine a Soviet squad armed almost entirely with PPSHs against German infantry equipped mainly with bolt-action rifles and a single light machine gun. The Soviets could pour out dozens of times more fire in the same moment. In the ruins of cities like Stalingrad, these drum storms often meant German squads were pinned down or annihilated before they could react. The PPSH drum wasn't flawless. Feeding problems sometimes plagued it, especially in early models, but its psychological weight was immense. For German soldiers, hearing the continuous roar of a drum-fed PPSH meant the enemy could keep firing long after their own clips were empty. Captured diaries reveal how German troops loathed facing PPSH-armed Soviets at close range. One soldier wrote, "It was like they had endless bullets. We shot 1, 2, then they drowned us in fire." Another account from Stalingrad described squads vanishing under the unrelenting bursts, unable to reload fast enough to answer back. Even when Germans captured PPSHs and used them themselves, the sight of a soldier carrying one often sowed confusion. Friend or foe? Its silhouette and thunderous chatter marked it as uniquely Soviet, a weapon that became a battlefield signature of terror. The PPSH-41 wasn't just terrifying because of its firepower. It thrived where German weapons often failed. The Eastern Front was a battlefield of extremes. Summer heat that clogged weapons with dust, autumn mud that fouled every mechanism, and winters so brutal that steel froze solid. German submachine guns like the MP38 and MP40 were finely crafted. Almost too delicate for such conditions, in freezing temperatures their springs stiffened and bolts jammed. In mud, their precision parts clogged. Soviet troops watched these failures with grim satisfaction because their PPSHs kept firing through it all. The PPSH's rugged simplicity was its secret. Its loose tolerances meant that dirt and ice didn't choke it as easily. Soldiers could drag it through snow, fire it after crawling through mud, or bang it against rubble without fear. In Stalingrad, its wooden stock didn't freeze skin like cold steel. In forests, it endured rain and grime that ruined finer guns. For Soviet infantry, this meant reliability. Their lifeline would not betray them. For Germans, it meant facing an enemy whose weapons seemed immune to the very environment that punished their own. Imagine the despair of huddling in frozen trenches, rifle jammed, while hearing the PPSH bark relentlessly from the other side. The PPSH wasn't elegant, but it was built for this war, on this front. Every burst that echoed across the steppe, every spray of bullets in a ruined factory, reminded the Germans that they were fighting not just men, but a weapon tailor-made to thrive in the hellish extremes of the Eastern Front. Nowhere did the PPSH-41 earn its reputation more than in Stalingrad. The city's shattered ruins, factories, basements, and half-collapsed apartment blocks became the perfect stage for close-quarters combat. Streets were reduced to rubble, walls full of jagged holes, stairwells blown apart. In this maze of destruction, long rifles were clumsy. But the PPSH, it was king. German survivors described the horror of Soviet assaults where squads armed with PPSHs burst into rooms or cellars, unleashing storms of bullets before defenders could even aim. The chatter of dozens of burp guns created an echo that bounced through alleys and factories, making it impossible to tell where the fire was coming from. Men froze in fear, convinced enemies were everywhere. In memoirs, German infantrymen recalled that fighting in Stalingrad meant fighting ghosts. A shadow in a stairwell, a figure darting between walls, and then the roar of PPSH fire that seemed to fill the air itself. The weapon's terrifying rate of fire magnified the chaos of urban warfare. Soviet troops wielding PPSH became a symbol of Stalingrad itself, relentless, close, and merciless. For German soldiers, the psychological toll was staggering. One veteran admitted, "When we heard that sound, we knew it was over. It was like the city itself was spitting fire at us." The PPSH didn't just kill, it broke morale. Stalingrad was already a nightmare of hunger, cold, and endless fighting. But for Germans on the ground, the memory of those Soviet burp guns echoing in the ruins became one of the most haunting sounds of the entire war. A mechanical symphony of fire that spelled their doom. The PPSH-41 was so effective that even the Wehrmacht couldn't resist using it. German soldiers quickly learned that in close combat, their MP38s and MP40, with smaller magazines and slower rates of fire, were no match for the Soviet gun. When possible, they picked up captured PPSHs, sometimes converting them to fire 9mm rounds so they could use their own ammunition. Entire German units were seen carrying Soviet burp guns, a testament to the weapon's battlefield dominance. Veterans remembered how strange it felt. The very weapon they feared most became one of their own tools of survival. It was a grudging respect, born not of admiration, but necessity. But using a PPSH came with risks. The distinctive roar of its fire often led to friendly fire. German troops firing captured PPSHs could be mistaken for Soviets, drawing deadly fire from their own comrades. The silhouette of the gun and its unmistakable chatter were so tied to the Red Army that no amount of camouflage could disguise it. For the Soviets, the fact that Germans willingly armed themselves with the PPSH was proof of its superiority. It became a source of pride. Their weapon had turned the tables, forcing the enemy to rely on the very gun they dreaded. On both sides of the line, the PPSH-41 became a weapon of survival. But to German infantry, carrying one was always a gamble between life and death. By 1943, the PPSH-41 wasn't just a weapon, it was an avalanche. Soviet industry churned out millions of them, flooding the Red Army with firepower. Entire platoons carried nothing but submachine guns, transforming ordinary infantry into close-range firestorms. German riflemen, armed mostly with bolt-action Kar 98 KS, often found themselves hopelessly outgunned. A single Soviet squad with PPSHs could unleash more fire in seconds than an entire German section firing rifles. When massed together, these squads created rolling waves of firepower that seemed unstoppable. This sheer scale was demoralizing. Diaries from German soldiers reveal the dread of facing Soviet units armed almost entirely with PPSHs. "They came at us in waves," one survivor wrote. "The sound never stopped. You could not fire fast enough. It was like being drowned in bullets." The numbers mattered as much as the noise. The PPSH was simple and cheap to produce, meaning every Soviet offensive carried legions of men equipped with them. To the Germans, it felt like no matter how many they killed, more appeared, each with the same dreaded burp gun clutched in their hands. By mid-war, the PPSH-41 was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of Soviet mass warfare, relentless, overwhelming, and terrifying. German soldiers learned that once the sound of the burp guns filled the air, the storm was already upon them and survival was far from guaranteed. If the Eastern Front was hell, then close-quarters combat was its deepest circle. And in that inferno, the PPSH-41 reigned supreme. Trench raids, night assaults, and ambushes in the forests or villages were the moments where the Burp Gun showed its true purpose. Soviet doctrine prized aggression, charge fast, overwhelm the enemy, and drown them in fire. With the PPSH, this became terrifyingly effective. German survivors often described these attacks in vivid, horrifying detail. As darkness would be pierced by sudden gunfire, and then the unmistakable roar of dozens of PPSHs would erupt, echoing like thunder through the night. Before riflemen could chamber their second round, Soviets were already on top of them, unleashing 71 rounds in a single sweep. Trenches turned into slaughterhouses in seconds. Even machine gunners, the backbone of German defenses, found themselves outpaced. The sheer volume of PPSH fire could pin down MG crews long enough for Soviet soldiers to rush in with grenades. It felt like the earth itself was spitting bullets, one Wehrmacht soldier later recalled. You couldn't tell where they were coming from. You only knew you were about to die. For German infantry, facing the PPSH wasn't just a battle. It was chaos incarnate. Every trench raid or close-quarter assault carried the risk of being wiped out in a storm of lead before even firing back. The PPSH didn't just win fights, it crushed morale, leaving survivors shaken long after the battle ended. As the war dragged on, the PPSH became more than just a weapon. It became the sound of Soviet resurgence. German soldiers came to associate its rattle with impending doom. The chatter of PPSH fire meant that the Red Army wasn't retreating anymore. They were advancing, and they were unstoppable. For Soviet troops, the PPSH carried a different meaning. It was their trusted companion, a weapon they knew would fire through mud, ice, and snow. It became a source of confidence, a tool that gave ordinary infantrymen the ability to fight back against the once feared German war machine. Soldiers nicknamed it their little friend, a piece of steel that gave them hope and power in the darkest moments. German diaries and reports often mention the psychological impact of the PPSH's presence. Entire units described feeling their resolve weaken just hearing its chatter in the distance, knowing an assault was imminent. It was no longer just a weapon, it was a harbinger. By 1944 and 1945, when Soviet forces were rolling westward through Eastern Europe, the PPSH's roar symbolized more than firepower. It symbolized revenge, liberation, and victory. To the Germans, it was the sound of the tide turning against them. To the Soviets, it was the music of triumph. By the war's end, the PPSH-41 had earned its place as one of the most iconic weapons in history. Over 6 million were produced, flooding every front of the Eastern War. For German soldiers, it remained a symbol of terror, the weapon that haunted their memories, that drowned them in firepower, that left countless comrades dead in trenches, forests, and city ruins. For the Soviets, it became a national icon, the gun that leveled the playing field against a technologically superior enemy. In statues, paintings, and photographs, the PPSH is still seen slung over the shoulders of victorious Red Army troops marching into Berlin. It was rugged, relentless, and brutally efficient, everything the Soviet war machine aspired to be. Its influence didn't end in 1945. The PPSH went on to serve in Korea, Vietnam, and countless other conflicts, its design copied and modified by nations across the globe. It became one of the most widely used submachine guns of the 20th century, a lasting legacy of Soviet engineering under fire. But above all, the PPSH-41 was remembered for what it did in World War II, terrifying German soldiers, empowering Soviet troops, and changing the face of close-quarters combat. To this day, the Burp Gun stands as a symbol of both fear and victory, the weapon that roared across the Eastern Front and left an indelible mark on history.